The phosphorescent wake of 5 American destroyers cut through the obsidian waters of the Solomon Sea like spectral fingers reaching toward destiny. It was the early hours of November 25th, 1943, and Captain Arlo Burke stood on the bridge of USS Charles Osborne, his weathered hands gripping the rail as radar signatures danced across the green screens below. The hunt was on. Burke's Task Force 39 had been prowling these treacherous waters for weeks, seeking the elusive Tokyo Express, those fast Japanese destroyer runs that had been bleeding American forces dry. With their nocturnal supply missions to Buka and Bonus, tonight, intelligence suggested, would be different. Tonight, they had finally cornered their prey. The destroyer force consisted of Charles Osborne, Claxton, Dyson, Converse, and Spence, all sleek, modern Fletcher-class vessels bristling with 5-inch guns and torpedo tubes. These ships represented the new breed of American naval power, faster and more heavily armed than their predecessors, crewed by men who had learned the bitter lessons of Guadalcanal and Iron Bottom Sound. As the formation sliced through the darkness at 27 knots, Burke's mind raced through the tactical possibilities. The Japanese were predictable in their methods. They would approach Cape St. George at high speed, deliver their supplies to the airfields, and retreat before dawn could expose them to Allied air attacks. But predictability could be a weakness, and Burke intended to exploit it. The radar operator's voice crackled over the intercom, tense with anticipation. Contact bearing 045, range 22,000 yards. Multiple targets, sir. Burke felt his pulse quicken. After months of frustration, of arriving at empty anchorages and finding only the lingering scent of enemy exhaust, they had finally achieved what every destroyer captain in the South Pacific dreamed of, a perfect intercept. According to declassified Navy Department records from the National Archives, the Japanese force consisted of 3 destroyers, Onami, Makinami, and Ujiri, under the command of Captain Kyoto Kagawa. They were carrying supplies and personnel to reinforce the beleaguered Japanese positions on Bougainville, part of the increasingly desperate effort to maintain their grip on the Northern Solomons. The night air was thick with tropical humidity and the metallic scent of gun oil. As Burke's crews went to general quarters, below decks, engineers coaxed every ounce of power from the turbines while damage control parties stood ready, with their tools and patches. The veterans among them remembered other night actions, Savo Island, where American cruisers had burned like torches, and Guadalcanal, where destroyers had slugged it out at point-blank range until the sea ran red with blood. Burke adjusted his course slightly, positioning his force to achieve the ideal firing solution. The Americans had learned from their early defeats in these waters. No longer would they charge headlong into Japanese torpedoes, or allow themselves to be caught in the deadly embrace of close-range combat. This time, they would use their superior radar and gunnery to strike from the shadows. The gap between the opposing forces closed with mechanical inevitability, each mile bringing them closer to a collision that would echo through the annals of naval warfare. The first salvos erupted across the midnight waters like lightning frozen in time. Burke's lead destroyers opened fire at 11,000 yards, their 5-inch guns spitting flame into the darkness as star shells bloomed overhead, casting an eerie silver light across the churning sea. The Battle of Cape St. George had begun in earnest. Captain Kagawa's Japanese destroyers, caught in the harsh glare of the illumination rounds, twisted and turned like serpents seeking shadows. Onami, leading the enemy formation, immediately began laying smoke while her sisters opened fire with their own batteries. The night exploded into a cacophony of screaming shells and the thunder of naval rifles. Charles Osborne shuddered as enemy shells straddled her hull, sending towering columns of seawater cascading across her decks. Burke, his face illuminated by the orange flashes of his own guns, calmly adjusted his formation's course to maintain the range advantage. The Americans had learned the hard way that Japanese torpedoes were deadly at close quarters. The dreaded long lance could reach out 20 miles with devastating effect. Aboard Claxton, Lieutenant Commander Harold Larson watched through his binoculars as the enemy formation began to separate. Onami was taking heavy punishment from the concentrated American fire, her superstructure already glowing with internal fires, but Ujiri and Makinami were attempting to close the range, their wakes arrow straight as they charged toward the American line. The tactical situation evolved with deadly precision. Burke had positioned his destroyers in a classic crossing the T formation, allowing all his ships to bring their forward guns to bear, while limiting the enemy's ability to reply effectively. It was a textbook maneuver, executed with the cool professionalism that had become the hallmark of the new American destroyer force. Dyson's guns found their mark first. sending a salvo directly into Onami's midship section. The explosion was visible even at this range, a brilliant orange flower that bloomed against the enemy's hull. Before collapsing into rolling black smoke, the Japanese destroyer's speed began to falter as her engine room flooded, but Kagawa was no novice, even as Onami died beneath him. He ordered his remaining ships to launch their torpedoes and turn away under cover of smoke. 24 long lance torpedoes hissed into the water, their oxygen-fueled engines leaving barely visible wakes. As they raced toward the American formation at 49 knots, Burke's radar operators called out the torpedo tracks with mechanical precision. Fish in the water, bearing to 70, multiple contacts. The American destroyers began their deadly dance, turning away from the torpedo tracks while maintaining their fire discipline. This was the moment that separated veteran crews from green ones, the ability to maneuver violently while keeping their guns on target. Converse, bringing up the rear of the American formation, executed a perfect emergency turn to starboard just as 3 torpedoes passed through her wake. The phosphorescent trails were clearly visible in the darkness, and several sailors later reported they could hear the weapons engines as they passed harmlessly astern. According to contemporary Navy combat reports housed at the Naval War College, the engagement reached its climax when Makinami attempted a desperate torpedo run directly at the American line. Her captain, likely realizing that his only hope lay in closing the range, pointed his destroyer's bow directly at Charles Ausburn and increased the flank speed. The charge was magnificent in its futility. American shells converged on the attacking destroyer like steel rain, turning her forward sections into twisted wreckage. But she continued her charge, her remaining guns still firing, until a direct hit in her forward magazine ended her gallant run in a towering column of flame and debris. The sea around Cape St. George had transformed into a hellscape of burning oil and twisted metal. Onami lay dead in the water, her hull glowing like a forge as internal explosions sent showers of sparks into the tropical night. The proud destroyer that had once terrorized Allied shipping lanes was now a funeral pyre, her crew abandoning ship into the shark-infested waters. Burke pressed his advantage with the relentless efficiency of a master tactician. His destroyers maintained their disciplined formation while pursuing the fleeing Ujiri, the sole survivor of Kagawa's force. The Japanese captain had managed to extract his ship from the killing ground, but he was wounded, outgunned, and running for his life through waters that had become an American hunting preserve. Spence and Converse, the 2 rearmost ships in Burke's formation, were ordered to continue the pursuit while the remaining destroyers dealt with survivors and ensured the destruction of the crippled enemy vessels. The night air reeked of credite and burning oil as American searchlights swept across the debris field, seeking signs of life among the wreckage. Lieutenant Commander James Williamson, commanding Spence, felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as his ship's turbines wound up to emergency power. The chase was the most exhilarating part of naval combat, that moment when a wounded enemy tried desperately to escape, while your own ship strained every rivet to run them down. His radar operators tracked Ujiri's increasingly erratic course. As the Japanese destroyers zigzagged desperately through the darkness, the pursuit stretched across 30 nautical miles of open ocean. Ujiri's captain demonstrated remarkable seamanship, using every trick in the destroyer handbook to avoid the American shells that reached out for his ship like grasping fingers. He laid smoke screens, changed course at irregular intervals, and even tried doubling back to confuse his pursuers' fire control solutions. But the Americans had evolved far beyond their early war capabilities. Their radar-directed gunnery was devastatingly accurate, and their ships were faster than anything the Japanese could feel. More importantly, their crews had been forged in the crucible of countless night actions, learning from each defeat until they had mastered the deadly art of destroyer combat. Contemporary accounts from the official records of the Union and Confederate navies describe how Converse finally closed to decisive range shortly after 0200 hours. Her 5-inch guns, directed by the most advanced fire control system in the world, began methodically dismantling Ujiri's superstructure with surgical precision. The Japanese destroyers' return fire grew increasingly sporadic as her gun mounts were knocked out one by one. Her speed dropped to 15 knots, then 10, as her engineering spaces took critical hits. Black smoke poured from her funnels, and her silhouette began to list noticeably to port as seawater flooded her hull. Through gaping shell holes, at 0-40-5 hours, Ujiri's magazines detonated in a blast that lit up the horizon. The explosion was so violent that it was reported by Allied coast watchers on Bougainville, over 60 miles away. When the flash faded, nothing remained but a spreading oil slick and floating debris. Burke's victory was complete. In less than 3 hours, his 5 destroyers had annihilated an entire Japanese task force without suffering a single casualty. It was a masterpiece of tactical execution, demonstrating how far American naval doctrine had progressed since the dark days of 1942. As dawn broke over the Solomon Sea, Charles Osborne and her sisters formed into column and began the journey back to their base at Purvis Bay. Behind them, the waters around Cape St. George were littered with the debris of Japanese ambitions, oil drums, life jackets, and the occasional piece of painted metal that had once been part of a proud warship. The tropical sun rose like a crimson eye over the devastated waters of Cape St. George, illuminating a scene of complete American triumph. As Burke's destroyers formed into their return formation, the magnitude of their victory became clear. Not a single American sailor had been killed or wounded, while an entire Japanese destroyer division had been wiped from the face of the earth. Aboard Charles Osborne, Burke stood on the bridge wing, surveying the oil-stained sea through his binoculars. The professional satisfaction of a job well done mixed with the sobering reality of what modern naval warfare had become. These weren't the gentlemanly duels of the age of sail. This was industrial-scale destruction delivered with scientific precision. The radio crackled with congratulations from Admiral William Bull Halsey himself, commander of the South Pacific Force. Halsey's message was characteristically blunt. Congratulations on a job superbly done. The Tokyo Express no longer runs on a railroad. The colorful admiral had been waiting months for such a decisive victory, and Burke had delivered it with mechanical perfection. Below decks, the destroyer crews began the methodical process of post-battle maintenance. Gun barrels were swabbed and inspected for wear, ammunition expenditure was calculated and logged, and damage control parties checked every rivet and weld for stress fractures. The ships had performed flawlessly, but the ocean was an unforgiving environment that could turn mechanical excellence into twisted wreckage in seconds. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, the gunnery officer aboard Claxton, compiled his after-action report with clinical precision. His ship had expended 140 rounds of 5-inch ammunition and achieved an estimated hit rate of 12%, exceptional accuracy for night combat. The new Mark 37 director and radar-controlled fire control system had performed beyond all expectations. The strategic implications of the victory extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. Japanese reinforcement efforts to Bougainville had been dealt a crippling blow. At a critical moment in the campaign, the supplies that Kagawa's destroyers had been carrying, ammunition, food, and medical supplies, were now scattered across the ocean floor along with the ships that had carried them. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese High Command was growing increasingly desperate in their attempts to hold the Northern Solomons. The loss of 3 more destroyers, vessels they could ill afford to spare, would force them to reconsider their entire defensive strategy in the region. Every Japanese warship lost now was irreplaceable, while American shipyards were launching new vessels at an unprecedented rate. As documented in Admiral Chester Nimitz's official dispatches to the Navy Department, the Battle of Cape St. George represented a watershed moment in Pacific destroyer operations. American tactics, technology, and training had finally achieved decisive superiority over their Japanese counterparts. The student had surpassed the master in the deadly art of night combat. The human cost of the victory was reflected in the enemy casualties. Approximately 900 Japanese sailors had gone down with their ships, including Captain Kagawa and most of his senior officers. These were experienced naval professionals whose loss would be felt. Throughout the Imperial Navy's remaining destroyer squadrons, Burke ordered his ships to conduct a brief search for survivors, more out of humanitarian obligation than any real hope of finding them. The tropical waters were infested with sharks drawn by the scent of blood and oil, and few men could survive long in such conditions. Nevertheless, several Japanese sailors were pulled from the water and taken prisoner, valuable intelligence sources who might reveal the enemy's future intentions. By 0800 hours, Task Force 39 was heading southeast toward Purvis Bay at 20 knots, leaving behind a victory that would echo through the remaining years of the Pacific War. The Tokyo Express, that symbol of Japanese naval supremacy in the dark days of 1942, had been permanently derailed. The Battle of Cape St. George was over, but its consequences would ripple across the Pacific theater for months to come. The reverberations from Burke's triumph at Cape St. George spread through both Allied and Japanese command structures like shock waves from a depth charge. Within hours of the action, coded messages were flying across the Pacific as both sides grappled with the strategic implications of the devastating American victory. At Combined Fleet Headquarters in Truk, Admiral Minaichi Koga received the news with characteristic stoicism. But those who knew him well could see the strain etched in the lines around his eyes. The loss of 3 destroyers in a single action was catastrophic for a navy already stretched beyond its breaking point. The Imperial Navy's destroyer strength, once the envy of the world, had been systematically ground down through 2 years of brutal attrition warfare. Captain Tameichi Hara, one of Japan's most experienced destroyer commanders, was summoned to brief the admiral on the tactical lessons of the engagement. His analysis was brutally honest. American radar-controlled gunnery had achieved a level of accuracy that made traditional Japanese night fighting tactics obsolete. The spiritual training and superior torpedoes that had once given Japanese destroyers their edge were no match for scientific fire control and disciplined seamanship. Meanwhile, at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz was already planning how to exploit Burke's victory. The success at Cape St. George had demonstrated that American destroyer forces were now capable of dominating the contested waters around the Northern Solomons. Plans were immediately set in motion to increase the tempo of operations, using the newly demonstrated American superiority to accelerate the advance toward Rabaul. The victory also had profound implications for American morale throughout the Pacific theater. For too long, American sailors had operated under the shadow of early defeats: Pearl Harbor, the Java Sea, Savo Island. The methodical destruction of Kagawa's force proved that American naval power had not only recovered from those early disasters, but had evolved into something far more deadly than anything the enemy could field. Burke himself was characteristically modest about his achievement. In his official after-action report, he credited his success to superior American radar technology and the excellent training of his crews. But senior officers recognized that his victory represented something more significant: the emergence of a new generation of American naval leaders who had learned to fight with both scientific precision and aggressive determination. The Japanese response was swift and predictable. Imperial Navy headquarters immediately began reorganizing their supply runs to avoid the kind of interception that had doomed Kagawa's force. New routes were planned, schedules were randomized, and additional air cover was allocated to protect the increasingly vulnerable Tokyo Express runs. But these measures came too late to affect the immediate situation on Bougainville. Japanese ground forces, already struggling against the American beachhead at Empress Augusta Bay, found their supply situation deteriorating rapidly. Without the ammunition and reinforcements that Kagawa's destroyers had been carrying, their defensive positions became increasingly untenable. According to classified intelligence summaries declassified in the 1980s, Japanese garrison commanders on Bougainville began reporting critical shortages within a week of the Cape St. George action. Artillery ammunition was rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and fresh water was becoming scarce as American bombing intensified. The strategic balance in the Northern Solomons had shifted decisively in America's favor. What had begun as a tactical victory for Burke's destroyers was rapidly evolving into a strategic triumph that would reshape the entire Pacific campaign. Japanese defensive plans that had seemed viable just days before now appeared hopelessly optimistic. In the face of American naval dominance, the Battle of Cape St. George had accomplished something that months of daylight bombing and amphibious assaults had failed to achieve. It had severed the lifeline that connected Japanese forward positions to their sources of supply and reinforcement. The Tokyo Express, once the symbol of Japanese naval supremacy, had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of fighting a technologically superior enemy with obsolete tactics. In the weeks following the battle, the full strategic magnitude of Burke's victory became apparent, as intelligence reports painted a picture of Japanese forces in the Northern Solomons slowly strangling on their own isolation. The destruction of Kagawa's supply mission had been the equivalent of cutting a major artery. Without constant reinforcement, the Japanese garrisons began to wither with mathematical inevitability. Admiral Halsey, never one for understatement, described the engagement in his personal diary as the night we broke the back of the Tokyo Express. His assessment was more accurate than perhaps even he realized. Japanese naval records captured after the war revealed that Imperial Navy headquarters had effectively abandoned their surface supply missions to the Northern Solomons. Following the Cape St. George disaster, the human cost of the victory extended far beyond the immediate casualties of the battle itself. On Bougainville, Japanese soldiers began dying from preventable diseases as medical supplies dwindled to nothing. Artillery units fell silent as their ammunition was exhausted. Most critically, the flow of replacement personnel ceased almost entirely, leaving understrength units to face the growing American pressure with no hope of relief. Lieutenant Colonel Hyakutake Saigon, commanding the Japanese 17th Army on Bougainville, sent increasingly desperate messages to Rabaul pleading for supplies and reinforcements. His communications, intercepted by American cryptographers, painted a grim picture of an army slowly consuming itself. Malaria rates exceeded 50% in some units, while others reported that they were reduced to eating grass and tree bark to survive. The psychological impact on Japanese naval personnel was equally devastating. The Tokyo Express runs had been more than just supply missions. They were symbols of Japanese naval prowess, demonstrations that the Imperial Navy could still strike at will. Despite growing American strength, the methodical annihilation of Kagawa's force shattered that illusion and left many Japanese sailors questioning whether their cause was already lost. Burke's destroyers, meanwhile, had become celebrities throughout the Pacific Fleet. Newspaper correspondents sought interviews with their crews, while Hollywood producers began planning movies about the fighting destroyer men of the South Pacific. The victory had provided American morale with exactly the kind of clear-cut triumph it needed. After months of grinding attrition warfare, the technological lessons of the battle were carefully studied by naval architects and weapons designers on both sides of the Pacific. American confidence in radar-controlled gunnery was vindicated, leading to increased production of fire control systems and more aggressive tactics in future destroyer actions. Japanese designers, conversely, began work on improved radar sets and electronic countermeasures, though material shortages would limit the effectiveness of these efforts. Perhaps most significantly, the battle marked the definitive end of Japanese naval dominance in the contested waters of the Central Solomons. American destroyer squadrons, emboldened by Burke's success, began conducting increasingly aggressive patrols throughout the region. The sea lanes that had once been Japanese highways became American hunting grounds where enemy vessels ventured at their peril. According to post-war testimony from captured Japanese officers, compiled by Allied intelligence services, the loss of surface supply capability forced the Japanese to rely entirely on submarines for reinforcing their forward positions. This proved woefully inadequate. Submarines could carry only a fraction of the supplies that destroyers could deliver, and their slow transit times made timely reinforcement impossible. The strategic initiative had passed irrevocably to the Americans. What had begun as a tactical engagement between opposing destroyer forces had evolved into a decisive turning point that would accelerate the Allied advance. Throughout the Pacific theater, the Battle of Cape St. George would be remembered not just as a victory, but as the moment when American naval power finally achieved the kind of clear supremacy that would characterize the remainder of the Pacific War. The morning of November 26, 1943, dawned over a fundamentally altered Pacific theater as Burke's destroyers steamed triumphantly back to Purvis Bay. Their victory at Cape St. George had already begun reshaping American naval strategy and Japanese defensive planning across thousands of miles of contested ocean. Within the gleaming corridors of the Navy Department in Washington, news of the engagement was received with a mixture of professional satisfaction and strategic relief. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox immediately authorized the release of carefully edited details to the American press, understanding that the home front needed tangible evidence that the long, bloody campaign in the Pacific was finally turning in their favor. The New York Times headline read, "Navy destroyers smash Jap supply run," while the Chicago Tribune proclaimed Tokyo Express derailed by American sea power. These accounts, while necessarily limited by wartime censorship, conveyed the essential truth: American naval forces had achieved a level of tactical superiority that made Japanese surface operations increasingly suicidal. Burke himself was promoted to Commodore and given command of an entire destroyer squadron, recognition that his victory represented more than just tactical brilliance. He had demonstrated that American naval doctrine had evolved to match the technological advantages provided by superior radar and fire control systems. The methodical destruction of Kagawa's force became a textbook case study in modern destroyer tactics. The Japanese response was equally telling in what it revealed about their strategic situation. Imperial Navy headquarters quietly abandoned all surface supply missions to the Northern Solomons, effectively conceding control of these vital sea lanes to American forces. This decision, forced by the tactical reality demonstrated at Cape St. George, accelerated the collapse of Japanese positions throughout the region. On Bougainville itself, the effects were immediately apparent. American ground forces reported that Japanese artillery, Fire decreased dramatically in both volume and accuracy as ammunition supplies dwindled. Enemy counterattacks became increasingly desperate and poorly coordinated as communication equipment failed due to lack of spare parts. Most tellingly, Japanese prisoners began surrendering in increasing numbers, a phenomenon almost unknown in the early years of the Pacific War. The broader strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate theater of operations. Japanese defensive planners, confronted with the reality of American naval supremacy, began accelerating their withdrawal to what they termed the absolute defense line, a perimeter running through the Marshall Islands, Caroline Islands, and western New Guinea. The Northern Solomons, once considered a crucial forward position, were effectively written off as untenable. American planners, conversely, began revising their timetables for the advance toward Rabaul and the Philippines. Operations that had been scheduled for late 1944 were moved up to early summer as it became clear that Japanese resistance was crumbling faster than anyone had dared hope. The victory at Cape St. George had not just won a battle, it had compressed the entire timeline of the Pacific War. The battle's legacy extended into the post-war era, where it became a case study in the decisive application of technological superiority. Naval historians would later identify it as the moment when American destroyer forces achieved parity with, and then surpassed, their Japanese counterparts in the art of night combat. The methodical precision of Burke's victory contrasted sharply with the chaotic melees that had characterized earlier destroyer actions. Perhaps most significantly, the Battle of Cape St. George represented the final transformation of the United States Navy, from a force still learning the harsh lessons of modern warfare, into the dominant maritime power of the 20th century. The confident professionalism displayed by Burke's crews reflected months of intensive training, technological innovation, and tactical evolution that had turned early defeats into decisive victory. As the sun set over the Solomon Sea on that November evening in 1943, it illuminated waters that would never again witness the sight of Japanese destroyers racing through the darkness on supply missions to beleaguered garrisons. The Tokyo Express had made its final run, and with its demise, the tide of war in the Pacific had turned irrevocably toward Allied victory. The Battle of Cape St. George was over, but its legacy would echo through the remaining years of the war and beyond, a testament to the power of technological innovation, tactical excellence, and the unwavering courage of the men who fought beneath the Southern Cross.